Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where in the world you are watching this. Welcome. At the end of Parshas Chayei, which deals with all of the events that took place after Sarah's death, we read, and this is chapter 25, verse 1, Avraham again took a wife. Her name was Keturah. This, of course, was Hagar, who had been banished decades earlier. And she bears him 6 children. The question is, Abraham is now 140 years old, right? This is 40 years after the birth of Isaac. How is it the Torah doesn't indicate that this was miraculous? The birth of Yitzchak, which takes place 40 years earlier, is described as a miraculous event for both Sarah and Abraham. Because when they were told they would have a child, Sarah not only marvels or wonders, questions even perhaps her own ability, but she also says, and my husband is old. How is it that we'll possibly father children? Of course, the miracle happens, and Yitzchak is born. Now it's 40 years later, and Avraham is having children again, and yet the Torah just records it as if it's the most natural thing in the world. Now, this is an obvious question many of the commentaries pose. One of the answers is, well, when Isaac was born, he was rejuvenated. And because he was rejuvenated, so, sometime later, 40 years later, from arguably coming from a young man, it isn't all that miraculous if he's now rejuvenated and become youthful again in terms of the ability to bear children, that he would bear children only 4 decades later. However, this suggestion is untenable because the Torah itself says, and Avraham became old. It states it again. So the Torah, this is after the story of Yitzchak. He's old and cometh of days. Zokein and bo bayomim. So the Torah itself testifies to the fact that he has become old. So our question remains, how does a very old man bear children, even older than he was at 100? And the Torah again doesn't indicate that it was miraculous. It's as if it's to be expected. That's the simple question, friends. But that simple question is going to open the door to a very profound understanding of, well, the mission of the Jew and the respective roles of men and women in realizing this great mission and purpose. Let's begin our journey. Let us first note the following. When Yitzchak was born, we are told as follows. This is Parshas Vayera, chapter 18, verse 12. Sarah declares, Kol Hashemeya Yitzchak li. I'm sorry, not the wrong quote. This is, chapter 21, verse 6. All who hear that I have given birth will laugh or rejoice with me. And Rashi explains, laugh with me, yismach olai, they will rejoice with me. Why? And Rashi goes on to explain, quoting from our sages. Here's the quote. Many childless women conceived when she did. Many sick were healed that day. Many prayers were answered with hers, and there was much joy in the world. So the question is, God doesn't do miracles for nothing. It's one thing that Sarah has a child at the advanced age of 90 years old. But why was it necessary that other women conceive? Many sick are healed, prayers answered, and in the final words of our sages, much joy in the world. That clearly indicates, which we shall explore, that the birth of Isaac necessitated not just that miracle alone, the heir to Abraham, the next link, the critical link in the forging of the Jewish people and their identity, but it also needed to bring with it joy to the world at large. This is also seen in the very next verse. This is again chapter 21, now verse 8. Verse 7, where she said, Sarah, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah, your wife, would nurse children? Children. She only has one child. Why the plural? So Rashi notes, why is bonim, children, written here in the plural form? Because on the day of the feast, this is the day that he was weaned, the princesses brought their children with them, and she, Sarah, nursed them. For they were saying that actually Sarah had not given birth, but brought in a foundling from the street, and that charge was laid to rest. So the fact is that here too, a little bit later on, when he grew older and was weaned, again, there's this effect on the world on princes, no less, or princesses rather, and Sarah nurses their children. The question is, why is this necessary? Why is this necessary? The answer is by first asking another question. We read earlier when God first promises to Abraham, this is Parshas Lech Lecha, this is now Genesis chapter 15. Where God says, I'll make you a great nation, and Abraham says, but I don't have any children. So God appears to him and says that you will. Not your servant will be your heir, but God takes him outside and tells him to look at the stars in the sky, and that's how numerous your children will be. What's the significance of him taking him outside? Well, obviously to see the stars, but there's more to it, and Rashi explains. Simple meaning, he took him out of the tent to see the stars. But Rashi quotes from the Medrash and says, leave your astrological calculations. You've looked at the stars and you've seen it's not in the stars, literally, that you or Sarah would have children. You did see correctly. But go beyond, go outside of that. You've seen you're not destined, but you are. For what you're seeing is that Avraham, which was his original name, will not have a son. Sarai, her original name, will not bear a child, but I will change her name. You will become Avraham, and Sarai will become Sarah, and you will have children. So that's the meaning of leave your perception that which you have seen in the stars, which is symbolic of the laws of nature. I lift you above the laws of nature. I do so by changing your name. A name is a conduit for the divine soul, for divine energy, so the configuration changes now. Avram no, Abraham yes, Sarai not, Sarah yes. But here's the question. This change name is a change in meaning. Avram means exalted father. Avram. Sarai means my princess. The change now? Avraham, father of many nations. Sarai, my princess, is now changed to Sarah, the princess. The one literally exalted above all. Now this is mightily strange. We're talking here now about them having a child, Yitzchak, that's going to be the next link, unique link, exclusive link of the Jewish people. We're not talking about the nations of the world. So it's incongruous that in order for him to bear Yitzchak, the first Jewish child, he's the first Jewish child born to Abraham and Sarah. This is Sarah's legacy, that the Jewish people descend from the two of them, exclusively actually, or more particularly from Sarah. So he's the first child born Jewish. Abraham and Sarah are not born Jewish. He is. So in order to give birth to the Jewish child, the names are going to be changed from a particular name to a universal name. Avram, exalted father, that's not going to give birth to Yitzchak. Avraham, father of many nations, we speak not of many. On the contrary, here it's about forging the unique, particular, exclusive identity of the Jew. Sarai, my princess, doesn't have the Jewish child. Sarah, the princess, does. So the answer, friends, is the same answer to why when Yitzchak is born, there is much joy and celebration in the world. And that's because the mission of the Jew is to transform and enlighten the world. That's what chosen people means. And that needs to be established at the very outset, at the very birth of the first Jewish child. Here, with his birth comes change, blessing to the world at large. And that's why when Sarah is blessed, many prayers are answered and much joy in the world and so on. And that's why in order to have Yitzchak, her name must become universal, setting the context for the mission of this child, which is chosen to be responsible for humanity. Not chosen and humanity rejected. And that explains our original question too. Let's answer the original question now, and then we'll deepen the answer and deepen our whole discussion. Our original question, friends, was Abraham gives birth to, remarries, Keturah, has children, no mention of a miracle. Answer, that's really an extension of the miracle of the birth of Yitzchak. Now, just like the birth of Yitzchak also brought to blessing for others, for Sarah it was immediate. But for Avraham, his effect will be also fathering nations and others, and he sends them to the east, as we learn later, which is really a separate discussion, but he sends them to the east and they bring with them really the seeds of ultimately spirituality and monotheism and oneness, which was corrupted for a long time, but still the notion of oneness pervades all Eastern religions. It all comes from Abraham and his children. That's all part of preparing the world for the Messianic era. So all to say, Yitzchak's birth brings to an effect on the world directly, immediately for Sarah, and for Avram too, sometime later, which we're not going to explain. Why for Sarah is it immediate, and Avram it's later. But let's make clear the answer. Why doesn't the Torah point at as a miracle with the birth of marrying Hagar and having 6 children? That's all a result of the miracle of giving birth to Isaac, which we saw with Yitzchak means an effect and blessing to the world. And for Avraham too. There will be children born later, and they will know at 140 years old, how did this happen? Because of the miraculous birth of Yitzchak, and that's carried through. He had a miraculous child then, and he has children now, non-Jews, which he sends to the east, but all part of Abraham and Sarah's effect on the world that needs to happen now with Yitzchak. But we're left to explain is, however, the difference in their effect. 2 things. For Sarah it's immediate, and for Avraham it's later. But here's the more critical distinction. Sarah's effect in the world is not something else. She's rejuvenated, so she nurses many children. The day her prayers are answered without her having to do anything, other prayers are answered. Sick are healed. Much joy in the world. She doesn't do anything. She's experiencing her own miracle, and others do as well, it seems naturally. Avram has to go and marry, do something. He has to remarry Keturah, have children, and that's his further effect on the world. All linked to Yitzchak. But our question is, why for Sarah is it immediate and natural? It's no additional effort. Her own state of blessedness and miraculous birth naturally brings all these miracles and blessings in its wake. Whereas for Avraham, he has to actually remarry and have children. It's a whole process. Why the difference? Then we're going to see this is all linked to the difference between men and women and our respective effect on the world in bringing the world to its final state. Bearing in mind that Abraham and Sarah, founding matriarch and patriarch of the Jewish people, their lives embody and they set in motion the means, and they embody the ultimate era, which we'll see at the end. It's all reflected in their lives and how they affect the world, to be fully realized by us, their children, over the millennia, mitzvah by mitzvah, culminating in the Messianic era. Let's begin the journey. Let's talk about the Messianic era. Friends, I want you to hear the following. The Messianic era is a time of universal enlightenment. Now, chosen, as mentioned moments ago, means we're chosen to be responsible. Jews are responsible to inspire, influence, and enlighten all of humanity. Let's see what Jewish law has to say about that. I'm quoting here from chapter 8 of Hilchos Melachim ul Mechamoteim, the laws of kings and their wars. That's the final section of the great body of Jewish law called Mishnah Torah, authored by the great Maimonides the Rambam. He writes, the Torah was given to the Jewish people as an inheritance. However, by the same token, quote, Moses was commanded by the Almighty to compel all the inhabitants of the world to accept the laws given to Noah's descendants. There are 7 Noahide laws, universal laws that apply. They're incumbent upon all of humanity. It's our job as the chosen people to see that they observe it. Now, just as an aside, for millennia, we as Jews were in no position to teach, inspire, or enlighten. We were happy just to survive another day. But all that has changed in recent decades, in an open world, in a world where most, if not all, Jews live freely as Jews, in democracies for the most part, and the ability to affect, to change, to voice an opinion. And so now it's possible for Jews to finally truly live up to our role as the chosen people. And there's a very receptive ear out there for our message. And in fact, an expectation for the message, which is why the world's obsessed with the Jew, because it feels somehow that we have something to share. And that is holiness, spirituality, embodied in the 7 Noahide laws. So that's what the Rambam is stating here. That law it's part of Torah from day one. We are obligated to see to it that humanity, each individual, countries and nations, live by this moral code. It's called the 7 Noahide laws because 6 of these laws were given to Adam and Eve. The 7th, which has to do with respecting animals and not being cruel to animals, was given to Noah. So now they're called the 7 Noahide laws. And all humanity are descendants of Noah, including Jews, because the entire population was wiped out. We all descend from Noah, so these laws are called the 7 Noahide laws. The listener or the viewer can explore this further on kosher websites that talk about the 7 Noahide laws. In fact, Chabad.org has, I'm sure, a section where you could Google that and find more information as to what these laws are and so on. They're fascinating. 7 Noahide laws correspond to the 7 days of creation, the recipe for a harmonious, perfect world, which correspond to the 7 emotions of the human heart, 7 warnings of the tefillin, and so on. So, now let's revisit this. So, Maimonides says, in law number 10 of chapter 8, that, in summary again, Moses was commanded by the Almighty, and this is conveyed in the Torah, that it's our job to compel. Doesn't mean here twist arms, but it means, as we will see, using arguments and so on that will compel the conclusion that there's a God in the world and that the most productive way to live is a life based on these moral divine principles. All right. Then, that was law number 10, friends. In a separate law, number 11 of chapter 8 here, he says, Maimonides, anyone who accepts upon himself or herself the fulfillment of these 7 mitzvot and is precise in their observance is considered one of the pious among the Gentiles who will merit a share in the world to come. And then he adds, this applies, what applies? Being considered pious, righteous, and meriting a share in the world to come through observing the 7 mitzvot, if he or she accepts them and fulfills them because the Holy One, blessed be, commanded them in the Torah and informed us through Moses, our teacher. In other words, he or she will do so because it's a divine commandment conveyed in the Torah. If, however, the individual does so because of intellectual conviction, mitzvahs are done, but this would not relegate that individual as pious or wise in the truer sense. So the Rebbe asks it, the question is, why are these 2 points divided into separate laws? It should be one package. We're obligated to see that non-Jews are keep the 7 Noahide laws, and then continue by saying in the same law, and that should be done, not because their intellect makes sense, but because it's commanded by God, and that would relegate the Gentile and as a pious individual, a righteous Gentile, earning a share in the world to come. The fact that the Rambam divides these into separate laws means they're 2 separate things. Namely, when the Rambam speaks about what we need to do, it's law number 10. That is to see to it that they keep the 7 Noahide laws. Now, if that, he doesn't mention there that you have to tell them it comes from God. So, if they're going to accept the laws simply because it makes sense, they're beautiful principles, they promote harmonious living, it's a way for humanity to get along with each other, and they observe it, mitzvah is done. And our obligation has been fulfilled. But then the Rambam says it shouldn't stop, then a separate law. They should, and he's removed us from the equation. Removed us from the equation. Our job to compel, in quotations, to convince, to enlighten, is appreciate the value of these 7 Noahide laws and just look around and see it works. Live by these laws, you've got a happy life. Not just a happy life, a harmonious and peaceful existence. Job is done if we achieve that. Law number 11 says, kind of talking to the non-Jew himself, we've done our job. To be a righteous Gentile and pious Gentile and earn a share in the world to come, you've got to do this not because it makes sense only, of course it does, but because it's a divine commandment. So that's like a second stage, which isn't part of the Jews' mandate to see it happens. But he's saying it will, or ought to, and it ought to follow. But it's got to come from within. So what's the Rambam saying here? Incredible thing. So there's 2 stages to enlightenment, which the Jew is integral, our mission, chosen people. One is convince, compel, convince, prove that these laws make sense and they're the way to live. And then there's a second stage that comes from within that truly embraces the spiritual dimension of the laws. Having said that, let's note the following. When the Rambam describes the Messianic Era, friends, he uses 2 descriptions. One that appears at the end of chapter 11, and the other, the final words of chapter 12, which concludes the entire body of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, and the final statement on the Messianic Era. Let's look at these 2 descriptions. Again, chapter 11 and chapter 12. Listen carefully to the words. End of chapter 11. If a king will arise from the house of David, who is learned in Torah and observant of the mitzvot, as prescribed by the written law and the oral law, as David his ancestor was, and will compel, again that word compel, first all of Israel to walk in the ways of the Torah and reinforce the breaches in its observance and fights the wars of God, we may with assurance consider him the Mashiach. Not certain yet. If he succeeds, continuing this very same law, it's law number 4 of chapter 11. If he succeeds in the above, builds a temple in its place, and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he's definitely the Mashiach. So far he's talking about the Mashiach's effect on the Jewish people. He then goes on to say, he will then improve the entire world, motivating all the nations to serve God together. As the prophet Zephaniah declares, God is speaking, I will make the peoples pure of speech, and they will all call upon the name of God and serve him with one consent or one purpose. In both the description of his effect on the Jew and the non-Jew, he improves, he fixes, he compels, he wages God's wars. But look at the final description of the Messianic Era. The occupation, this is the end of chapter 12. Immortal words of the Rambam. The occupation of the entire world will be solely to know God. This is Jew and non-Jew. The entire world. They will know God. Therefore the Jews will be great sages and know hidden matters, attaining knowledge of their Creator to the full extent of human potential. And he concludes with a quotation from the prophet Isaiah, the world will be filled with the knowledge of God as the water covers the ocean floor, or the sea fills the ocean bed. This description here is a description of enlightenment, not convincing, the Jew doing his thing in the whole world, the Jew knowing the secrets of God in the whole world, its occupation being solely to know God. What's being said here? It's being said that there are these two stages here. Stage one is a stage of engagement, a war, convincing arguments. Stage two is the war is over. It's enlightenment, and it comes from within. It comes from within. When he described our obligation vis-a-vis the whole world, which Mashiach completes and perfects, we noted the two halachas. One law is we're obligated to convince the world that there's a God and to keep the 7 Noahide laws. And the next law is for the Gentile to be truly enlightened, it has to be, because it doesn't talk about us doing this, because that happens as a matter of course. After the convincing, when we achieve the stage of our own personal enlightenment, then we naturally inspire this. And here we come down to the difference between men and women, Abraham and Sarah. Let's just talk about men and women for a moment and then realize how this is all being hinted to here. Men win arguments by having arguments. Women arguments by wars, by the one who is stronger, wins the day. Peace through strength, if you like. Men do, as we often quote, women are. The woman is the nurturer. The peace that the woman can bring about is not through one side convincing the other or defeating the other, but by nurturing and finding that very truth in the so-called combatant and creating an internal true unity where the peace is coming from within and not compelled or forced from without. That's the feminine. That's the ultimate stage of the Messianic era. That's Shabbos. The year of the great Shabbos, which is the feminine day of the week. It's the Shabbos queen, the Shabbos bride, not the Shabbos king, not the Shabbos groom. Because Shabbos is about the perfect world that is perfect. We don't have to fix and tinker anymore. That's the weekday stuff, that's the male stuff. True, you don't get the Shabbos without preparing on Friday and Thursday. But once that's done, now it's about being and not fixing. So men fix, women are. Abraham's role, now we see the difference. Abraham's role at the very beginning of our people. Hang on, before we get to, Abraham and Sarah at the very beginning and their effect on the world at the very outset, setting the template for all of this. We've observed here in both our effect on the world and the Messianic era, the Rambam's description of the Messianic era. First it's the war and fixing, and then enlightenment from within. The pursuit of the whole world, the pursuit, this is what I desire, is nothing other than to know God. That's stage two. That's the feminine stage. And the first stage is the male stage. Weekday, then Shabbos. So all of this is profoundly expressed in Abraham and Sarah in the birth of the very first Jewish child. Right then and there's an effect on the world. It has to be. That's the whole reason, the whole purpose of life. That's what chosen people means. And here's the first Jewish child embarking on this great mission from his very birth. But right there's a feminine effect, which is at the very outset, and then Abraham's effect a little bit later. Sarah's effect is immediate because that's the end goal, and the end goal is expressed at the very outset. Kabbalistic principle, the beginning is wedged in the end. Her effect is There is joy and celebration in the world that comes naturally from within. Prayers are answered and miracles are happening. She doesn't have to convince anybody. She's not doing any act. She's just being Sarah in her truest and fullest sense, and the whole world is celebrating with her, naturally. But Abraham, with Yitzchak's birth, he affects the world too. But it takes time, it's going to come later, and he has to do something. He marries Sarah, and they have children, sends them away. It's a whole process of engagement. So it comes after her. She's first because that's the end goal, but in the process it'll be first the male and then the female. Will come full circle, and Sarah will be the final state. But we've answered our question. The birth of Yitzchak has to bring about an effect on the world. But there's a different effect. Sarah's effect, which is natural, spontaneous from within, and Abraham's effect that requires work to be done. It takes time, and it's a whole process, and you've got to do and fix and engage. Men do, or women are. So she embodies that, and that's why her effect is natural. Princesses are coming and bringing their children. She's not going out to convince anybody. They're bringing their children to her. And that answers at the end. Sarah, Abraham, those name change. So aside from the name changes imply a universality, not my Sarah, not just exalted father, but Avraham, father of multitude of nations. Sarah is not just mine, but Sarah, universal Sarah. Another thing is conveyed here. A father of a multitude of nations implies engagement. As a father leads. Sarah implies elevated. Princess, transcendent. Her very transcendent state naturally lifts the whole world with her. The true notion of malchut, the true notion of sovereignty, it's a true state of being. And when that's fully resonant and revealed, after all of the work that we've done, including the male battles to be fought and won, then the world is ready to be elevated from within and experience its own divinity, its own godliness. The whole world's pursuit is nothing other to know God. That's Sarah. Sarah implies this exaltedness, this elevation, universal elevation. In simple language, because the woman embodies malchut, this sovereignty, princess quality, the inherent value, sovereign value of every human being will naturally be expressed. Naturally be expressed. No need to fight anymore. Everybody is this unique human being for which God created the world. It all goes back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Our sages say, why is it that all of the creatures were created in great numbers at the outset, but man and woman were created one? Because every person is obligated to say the whole world is created for me. That's true. Every human being is everything for God. This intrinsic value from within. Not a hierarchy of one defeating the other, which is the male thing. It's hierarchical. But the female is every human being intrinsically, infinitely valuable. That is the feminine quality. That's the ultimate state of the Messianic era. The whole world universally, from within as it were, pursuing the knowledge of God. I hope that was conveyed clearly. And the most important thing is we stand on the cusp of all of this. Hence, the unique role of women today, as we stand on the Erev Shabbat of history, the Friday afternoon of history, time to light the Shabbos candles, time to bring in the great Shabbos, the great Shabbat, and it's time already to experience this world as a home for God. Home isn't about doing, pursuing, creating, fixing. It's about being. The deepest pleasure of being alive. And being alive means a creation of God, savoring the divine soul within each and every one of us. May we merit that without delay. Thanks for listening.